Well, we will go ahead now and take a deep dive into trust and politics and business. We have a great panel lined up for you here. For some of those of you who are just joining us, a quick reminder that the panel is on the record and that it is being live streamed. And for those of you who have your phones or laptops at the ready, the hashtag is CHLondon, and we do encourage, of course, everyone gathered in the room and everybody watching online to comment and ask questions and participate in our lively exchange as we move forward. I want to quickly introduce here our panelists. We have Nick Pickles here to my left, who is the head of public policy and government for Twitter. We have Ida Auken, who is with the Danish Social Liberal Party and has been for the last, I believe, 10 years actively involved in Danish political life. She's the former minister for environment and is currently the spokesperson for environment, business, and IT for her party. MJ Akbar, who has a very distinguished history within the political and literary life of India and is currently Minister of State for External Affairs. And Michael Stewart, who is Global Vice Chairman at Edelman and also responsible for Edelman Intelligence. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us here today in London on the one day that I think everyone is not on an airplane or going to and from meeting with constituents. Our topic on trust, I think, is a fascinating one because we tend to only talk about trust when we feel it's a problem. We tend to not sit around talking about how wonderful it is that we really feel a deep sense of trust with one another, with our institutions, with our leaders, when everything is swimming along supposedly as normal. But 2017 doesn't seem like a normal year to many of us in this room, and so it's no surprise that Chatham House has decided to identify trust as a key core area of conversation. Now, I have my background in the Silicon Valley at Google, YouTube, and Facebook. And I remember back in the old days when it was so much more innocent thinking about the relationship of people on social media, people on the internet, and trust. The 1st of April is widely known in many countries as April Fool's Day. It's the Silicon Valley's favorite holiday. April Fool's Day is when you play jokes on other people, you have a little bit of fun. And we used to love this at Google and YouTube. We'd sit around thinking about what kind of jokes we could play on everybody using the products. And the reason we could do that is because the trust coefficient was so high at the time in the Silicon Valley. The idea being that if you hopped on Google and looked something up, you were going to get the best possible result. The spam filters were getting so good that you could trust the information that was coming into your inbox. And I couldn't help but think, as I've been mulling over our conversation on trust, how much has changed. Do you play with trust on the internet anymore? Or is that starting to feel a little bit sinister? The joke, of course, around April Fool's Day in the Silicon Valley is that it's the only day that people stop and think whether they should trust what they read on the internet. But moving along, I think it helps us to frame everything we're discussing in terms of trust as both evolutionary and a balance. And when is the balance is right, and when does the balance feel a bit off? Michael, I'm going to pass over to you, actually, to help set us a scene of where we are in 2017 in terms of how it is that we see and frame and analyze and understand trust within our societies.
Great. Thanks very much, Elizabeth. At Edelman, we've been studying trust in institutions for 17 years. We have an annual survey, the Edelman Trust Barometer, that surveys 33,000 people across 28 countries. And we ask if they believe four institutions, business, government, media, and NGOs. Do you trust them to do the right thing? So it's a very basic high-level question. And in the last Trust Barometer, it is the first time in 17 years that trust in all four institutions declined. Normally, you have ebbs and flows. Some go up, some go down. And across all 4 institutions, the combined global trust is at 47%, which is deep into the distrust category and is the lowest number we've ever had. Just looking at a couple of them, the institutions in some specificity. Trust in government was by far the worst. Only 41% of the global respondents trust government to do the right thing. 75% of countries do not trust their governments. Media was slightly ahead at 43% trusting the media, but in 82% of the countries that we surveyed, there's a distrust of media overall. Business and NGOs were a little bit better, business at 52%. However, it had declined in 18 of the 28 countries year on year. And likewise, NGOs had declined in 21 countries, and historically, NGOs have been significantly more trusted than the other institutions, and that's no longer the case. We also ask, do they trust their leaders, specifically NGOs and CEOs and government leaders. Last year, CEO trust was 37%. That's down 12 points from the previous year. It's at an all-time low, and trust in CEOs declined in every single country surveyed, all 28. Likewise, government leaders are at a staggering 29% of trust. So people are not trusting their institutions, and they're not trusting their leaders. And so we asked another series of questions of, well, what are the implications of this, particularly on how do you feel about how you're being served by the broader system? So we asked people, do you feel that the system is working for you individually? And globally, 53% of the respondents feel the system is failing them. That's true. It demonstrates itself in a number of issues for them. This sense of injustice, a feeling that the system is only serving elites. There's a lack of hope for the future, the idea that their children's lives are going to be better than their own, or even their own lives are going to continue to improve in the future. There's a lack of confidence in leadership, as we've discussed. And importantly, there's a desire for change. What's really interesting this year is that was as true for the elites. So the people who we call the informed public, those with college education or higher, in the top 25%, top quartile of income, and who describe themselves as avid consumers of business and political media, 49% of them feel the system is failing them. So even the elites feel that something is amiss. Only 15% of people globally feel that the system is actually working their benefit. And then finally, we tracked this to a number of social and political issues and trying to get a sense of people's level of concerns and fears. And there's a direct line of correlation between lack of trust in institutions, feeling that the system is failing, and a feeling of concern and fear. So we asked people about things like globalization, immigration, eroding social values, and pace of innovation. And across all of those, the people who lacked trust in institutions and didn't feel the system was working had a disproportionate sense that these things were negative rather than positive. And we saw fear playing out in some very real political fashion. We did a flash poll around Brexit, and for those who voted to leave, 54% described themselves as fearful, compared to 27% of Remainers who described themselves as fearful. In the US presidential election, we did the same. 67% of Trump voters described themselves as fearful, compared to 45% of Clinton voters. So we see this as not a cyclical, but a structural issue where you have lack of trust in institutions, creating a lack of sense that the system is working for them, exacerbating fears that goes back up to the lack of trust in institutions.
When it comes to the national level, you do have some positive stories to tell about trust. One country in particular, can you share with us where I might be going with this leading question?
Absolutely. So MJ will be very happy to hear this. Of the 28 countries, there is one country for whom it is true that they trust all institutions, they believe the system is working for them, they trust their leaders, and they are on a low level of fear, and that's India. And is the only country that stands out in that regard.
I'm happy, but not surprised.
Good to hear.
So MJ, take us from there. You're happy but not surprised. Tell us why you're not surprised.
I wanted to shift the compass a little, with your permission. Having read the brief and having discussed with you, I think the biggest challenge from this absence of trust, we are missing it a little. It is not absence of trust in institutions, which is going to lead to great disorder, but absence of trust or growing distrust in the nation state itself. Today, in Spain, I don't think the people who are asking for independence in Catalonia want to change the parliamentary system or want to change democracy, but they've lost their faith in the Spanish state. You're sitting in a city where the country lost its faith in an imagined, real or imagined superstate. Scotland, very recently. So we are seeing a rise of, for a variety of reasons, of distrust in the nation state itself. And I do want to make this point, that the idea of a modern nation state actually emerged about 100 years ago, after World War I, when in the vacuum left behind by collapsing empires, a new regime, a new state had to be created. And this was a revolutionary idea came about, where the will of the people became perhaps the most important fact of the emergence of the modern state. Some countries went on to the next logical step of democracy, some didn't. But it was by and large the will of the people. And today we discover that the will of the people is a dynamic reality, which can shift and change and make a continuous demand. And therefore, while the will of the people changes governments, and we are all very happy about that, more or less, unless you are in government, when the will of the people begins to challenge the structure of the state, then we're looking at some very serious disorder. One point that we must address, the biggest challenge to order and the biggest preparation for disorder and even chaos is coming from Salafist jihadism. And we can't keep that elephant out of this room if we want to discuss the subject. Why? It has a very interesting history. In 1918, for a variety of reasons for which we have no time, every single Muslim in the world was colonized by a European nation. It is quite a remarkable fact, given the pride that Muslims had always had in their political abilities and in their whatever the structures that protect their politics. And then you saw the mass upsurge coming in which challenged colonization. And this was also a tremendous people's project. But then they saw neo-colonization, then they saw a variety of things. Now, surreptitiously, an idea began to get momentum, which was that if the ideas of man have failed, let us try the ideas of God. And that led to the rise of a notion which actually has no history, which was that religion can be the basis of nationalism. And this really found a geography not too far away from our country. And this geography then began to provide sanctuaries towards Islamism, or whatever you want to call it. And in what this spawned, with each failure, the return of what I have described in an essay as the romance of regression, in which an imagined caliphate becomes the answer to all problems. It's completely untrue historically, but the irrational has always been a part, particularly when irrationalism is sponsored by fear or uncertainty. Now, it is a very, very big mistake to think that the terrorists we see everywhere do not have a political agenda. They do have a political agenda. They are challenging the nation state and want to replace it with faith-based space, whether it is caliphate or whatever else it might be. Boko Haram today controls far more space than we actually imagine. And along with this, the use of fear as a potent poison in order to disturb the plural harmony that civilized people and societies have achieved. With great difficulty, it hasn't been an easy achievement. But to inject fear into the environment, with consequences particularly in democracies, which destabilize the nation state, destabilize people-to-people relations, and become a constant threat to the values of civilization that we believe in. I mean, I really don't want to go on this because it's time-consuming, among other things. But I just would like to leave you with some of these thoughts.
So the will of the people, it's so interesting that in today's world, we actually have a better opportunity than we've ever had before to get a window onto the will of the people, because so much of these conversations, so many of them play out online. Nick, you've been back and forth, I've seen on Facebook and Twitter, you've been back and forth between California, having conversations around information, disinformation, fake news, this whole debate as it's playing out between the political world and the tech world. How do you see our ability to better understand what MJ is describing, the will of the people, getting our head inside that game?
No, and I think that's perhaps the false dichotomy that often people start with, is that technology can fill the gap that's between governments and people. And I think one of the challenges is that we actually have become overly reliant on data to tell us what people are thinking in our countries, rather than actually speaking to people. So we rely on data in a way that gives us, in many cases, answers that skews to the questions that we ask. And anybody who says, in California, we talk a lot about how algorithms aren't neutral, polling questions aren't neutral either. They give you an answer in a certain direction. And so I think when you think how many people are fearful of the future. So in California, I was at Stanford at the launch of Stanford University's Global Digital Policy Lab, which was talking about issues around trust, around knowledge. And one of the questions was asked was around science. How is it that in this day and age, in an economy as large as America and in other countries, we could be having a debate about vaccines? There's a serious debate. There's celebrities, there's politicians, there's national TV stories covering a debate about vaccines that has no basis in science. And that in itself is quite remarkable. And I think one of the challenges we have is this issue of balance, in the sense that if someone has one point of view, then particularly traditional media organizations should have someone with a counterarching point of view, and that in itself is balance. But by that logic, if you have someone who says the world is round, you should give equal space to someone who says the world is flat. And I think we have a problem there, because I think in the current information environment, there are absolutely people who do not want us to have an argument based on facts. So my big worry is that we over-index to technology to fix these hard social problems. And I do wonder if one of the reasons why India is in such a good position is because the sheer scale of India means politicians cannot yet rely on technology to do all of this heavy lifting. They have to talk to people. They have to deliver public services that people want to use. They can't rely on the public services that are there already because they're the only choice. One of the things that President Clinton used to say is that politicians should never stop communicating. They should keep making an argument. Even when the election's gone, they should keep communicating. And I think my big worry for where we are is that governments may well have stopped communicating. There is a cycle of press releases and speeches. There are press stories written about what government is doing. But in a world where the vast majority of people use public services in a way that they don't feel is reflected in how politicians talk about those public services, that disconnect starts to happen. And so you end up with two separate debates happening. One in political circles and media circles, where people are saying everything's good, this is great. And in the real world, people going, I don't feel that. And then they express that on social media, and then they realize there are other people who feel this as well. So whether it's elections, whether it's referendums, people who may have been told, I turn on the television, I open a newspaper, and I don't really feel like my point of view is being expressed, suddenly open Facebook or Twitter and find lots of people with that point of view. And that's a challenge to political institutions that have, for many, many years, being able to rely, frankly, on people only seeing information that was put into the public domain by either institutions or government. So I think that is a really, really big challenge. The larger question, I think, is something that Matthew D'Ancona wrote in a book really recently, which I'd highly recommend, called Post-Truth. And he talks about how truth needs an emotional framework. We often talk in facts and figures, but actually emotion is a really, really important part of this discussion. And emotion on social media is very visual, but you look at politics sometimes and you feel the emotion and the narrative is lacking. So how do we connect what's really happening in the world with politicians so they can prioritize appropriately? And I think one of the big dangers is in the near term, there is a degree of alignment between traditional media and politicians feel that because something is in traditional media, it must for be good policy. And so it rapidly cycles around. And the rest of the country are watching this happen going, but this isn't what I feel. And so immigration is a good example of how that policy debate has changed. I think Europe is another good example in the UK. But equally, as I say, science reporting, climate change, big geopolitical issues. When was the last time you saw some heavyweight reporting talking about what's happening in Afghanistan in any major country? It's almost like it's kind of not happening, but if you look there, there's suicide bombings every day targeting government, targeting police, targeting public services, targeting civilians, but it's not talked about. Same with Libya, very little discoveries. So I think we need to get to a point where there is a lot of people who are using social media to speak to other social media about what matters to them, and the political solution being more micro-targeting, talk to fewer people. And actually we need to get back to a point, I feel, where governments need to make arguments. And so I come back to Edward R. Murrow. Truth is the best propaganda. But you need to make an argument in public. You need to defend your values. And I think in the modern age right now, there are incredible technological tools for governments to make those arguments around the world. My worry is that governments are looking inwards right now, not looking to make those values arguments internationally.
The balance between using data to make a good decision and meeting people to make good decisions and the responsibility that comes with that for a politician. Ida, we'd love to hear your reflections on that.
Yeah, this is very interesting because I think we should start to remember that democracy is not just voting. Democracy is conversation. And you should only go to voting to the point where you can get no further with conversation. And in a way, we've just accepted to go to a point where we just vote all things out of the way instead of going back to the conversation. So I think that is one thing to really remember. How do we get the conversation back, building on what you're saying? Secondly is to see that who are we talking to in this conversation? Are we just talking to the other parties? Are we just, as politicians, talking to the counterparts? Or are we talking to people? And I think the interesting thing is that people are not represented by NGOs either. So how do you go and talk to people when they don't feel represented anywhere? And it's a huge, it's really a complex in a way. It's really weird because we have all these channels to talk to people and we seem to not talk to them basically as politicians. And I would say we become this, all of us in this room, we have become this traveling elite talking to each other, losing our roots, losing our contact with normal people. Doesn't matter where we come from. You can come out of the slum. You might even actually still have left normal people's lives. And then we meet like this in nice 5-star hotels and have a great conference. And my first suggestion would be that for 2 years, ban all conferences. Just go out and talk to people. It's a really good place to start if you want to build trust. Secondly, I would say, what are populists doing really well? They are taking people seriously. The only problem with populists is that they claim to speak for the whole population, which is bad for a conversation, that there is no diversity. But to be honest, to wanting to try and figure out where people are, listen to them, talk to them, I think it's great news. And I think we should learn from them and go and talk to people. And this means, I mean, of course you cannot talk to 700 million people. Like that is pretty hard. But you can start, you know, in your local community. You can start by, I go on buses and trains and sit down and start chatting to people, saying, hi, I'm Ida, I'm a member of parliament. Most would recognize my face. Others in the train start listening. Is she really talking to a normal person in the train? I learn a lot from what they're saying. I learn a lot of where they are, where their lives, what words are they using, what's concerning them. And that's where, from there, I want to start my leadership. So it's not like I'm just not just saying, oh, they're scared, I should talk about all the dangerous things. No, they're scared. And I would say, I can understand you feel scared. Man, you can't open the news and it's all bad news, even though data tells us it's not that bad, maybe. But I want to start where they are. If they feel scared, I say, it's okay. So are the solutions you're getting from the populists, are they good? No, they're pretty bad. Are they solving your problems? No. Is Donald Trump going to solve the problems? Nah, I don't think so. Is the distinguished Boris Johnson going to solve the problems of the Brits that feel left out? Nah, I don't think so. I mean, so at least start by saying, I acknowledge that you have felt left out, that you felt that globalization, urbanization, modernization, digitalization has run over your head, and you can't follow the whole thing, start by saying that's okay. So you get one answer, populist answer, it's not really an answer. We're too bad at showing how poor those answers are, really. But we could do it much better using emotions, like you say, like, sure, it's just really bad politics. And then try to give better solutions, not pretending that they're perfect, not pretending like we can solve everything. We should bring down some of the expectations. And that might be my interpretation of India, that expectations might also be a little bit lower. I mean, I know how some bureaucrats work in India. I know how they work. I mean, I would say that expectations of meeting a system that delivers on all areas would probably be bigger in some countries than others. That I think one problem is that people have very, very high expectations, and we probably are guilty of that. So maybe also lower expectations a little bit. Tell people that this is difficult. I want to try and solve it, but it is difficult.
So
sorry, may I just?
Yes, please.
I mean, I already know why you're going to be re-elected. But on this low expectations, that in our experience is simply not true. In fact, the better the government, the expectations soar beyond the abilities of government. And that is one of the problems that you'll probably find that in polling as well. And the poor, in fact, who have been left behind, they're asking very serious questions, and they have every right to ask them, which is, how long are you going to deny us? And that is the challenge, that is the foremost single, if I had to suggest a reason, is because at the center and heart of governance is a single, but certainly not small, mission. And we use the word mission in a very, at least the Prime Minister does, in a missionary sense, which is that we have to eliminate this curse of poverty completely. And every single thing, and he says that while the statistics take time, and they will sort themselves out in some form or the other, the macro economic plans will sort themselves out. What have you done each day to improve the quality of life of the poor? So giving a woman a gas cylinder, which can stop the cold smoke from hitting her eyes to the power of something like 100 cigarettes a day, or entering her lungs, giving public facilities by which the toxins in her body, which she had to sort of internalize all this while because there were no toilets available. To make this into a mass program, to make this into a countrywide program, that really is at the heart of governance. And that really, and therefore, the poor are never unrealistic. They don't think that they're going to transit from a hut into a palace. What they ask is the movement towards improvement of my life or not? Right? And therefore, I've always thought that the most pernicious theory for countries like us was the one sent from a few extremely intelligent people in some country called the trickle-down theory. A trickle-down theory basically means that those who have swimming pools will get the waterfall, and those who are dying of thirst will get the trickle. It is not sustainable. The waterfall has to go to the poor who are thirsty. It is the rich who can do, with a few trickles after having seized the waterfalls for heaven knows how many generations. So it is this dynamic, really, which is also the sustaining heart of democracy. If democracy is not about the people, then what is it about?
Well, it's interesting that we've landed on the interplay between expectations and trust, because it strikes me that there is an overlap in the way that getting the expectation right in terms of the balance leads to either greater or less trust. You mentioned that democracy is a conversation. I like conversations. So let's have a conversation. I'm going to open up to some questions. Your hand first, sir. If you would please as well introduce yourself and your affiliation, that would be fantastic.
Thank you. My name is Adama Gaye. I'm an author, I'm a writer, and I do business. I'm from Senegal. Are we experiencing now the total demise of Francis Fukuyama's end of history and revival of history, if we see that with the capitalism creating this huge problem of inequality that we see even in places like Africa, does this not give some form of legitimacy to what President Xi Jinping in China is trying to do? To the point he has the gut to convene in March a conference on Marxism. You know, people didn't want to talk about Marxism, but now it's back to the fore. Are we not witnessing, since you have two huge nations, the US and China, speaking different things, that we are reviving now a new form of Cold War under economic terms, but to bring back Marxism in my mind, show that the level of distrust on capitalism this day across the world, including in Africa. I thank you.
Thank you. Legitimacy and trust. Michael, what responses do you have in terms of how it is that you have looked at the relationship between the two? In other words, do you have some reflections on when the trust level is high, but the legitimacy behind that trust actually seems quite dangerous, and where does that take us as societies?
I'm not sure I understand the legitimacy behind the trust level.
If the trust is quite high, but those who keep the trust are essentially in power of deciding how it is that they utilize or leverage the strength of their trust in that brand to a degree that we don't necessarily as global societies agree with, where does that lead us and how do we course correct?
Well, stepping back a bit, you know, what we've seen certainly in the past couple of years is what we call an inversion of influence. Right? And it's a combination of who people trust. So a person like me is the most trustable person on the planet, however you define yourself. That's who you trust. You trust them more than technical experts, you trust them more than academic experts, and you're typically meeting them either physically or in your social feeds. Right? And there's an echo chamber that's created around those people like me. You're 4 times more likely to disregard information that you disagree with or that is counter to a stand that you take. And 53% of people will not engage in any information, even in their social feeds, if it comes from a point of disagreement. Right? So the idea that there is an elite that can shape these conversations from on high and dictate with facts and with, you know, firm truths, to your point around why are we having conversations around vaccines, right? Those days are gone. And the point is, how do you engage people on their terms, in their language, right? And a place of authenticity. So one of the factors of Trump, why he was so compelling, it wasn't the things he was saying, it was how he was saying them, right? And he just came across as, that sounds more like people I talk to down the road. And today that has a lot more currency than it ever has.
Interesting, yeah. Tricia. Yeah, I think the mic is just coming here.
I think this is really interesting that you've had this whole panel discussion without mentioning the sort of very big trending word, which is corruption. And I actually think there are brilliant books that have been written in the last 3 or 4 years, and you need just read one of them to understand how endemic and how intractable it is, and it starts, whether it's in Afghanistan and it ends up here, it's all very connected. The money now starts at the top, it trickles to the second layer, and then stops there, goes back up, and then out of the country. And so the type of corruption there is now is all over the world. And perhaps why India and maybe China, there's more of a trust issue with their leaders, is that they are being seen to tackle it very, very aggressively. Whether they have success or not, whether they can even begin to go into those layers is a different thing, but they are being seen that way. Transparency, online living as we do, we know where people are cheating their way through, from Trump to our own governments to Spain. Spain might be in a very trustful environment with their own government compared to Catalonia. There are a lot of people now who are, waving the flags in Madrid, but it won't be sustainable if Spain does not clean up its act. Every person's got their, fingers in the till. Corruption hasn't been mentioned once, because every time one tries to kind of deal with it, it is just almost impossible to penetrate. What are your opinions on how we move forward on that?
MJ, do you want to start us off, and then Ida perhaps as well?
Yep, shall I?
Yeah, please.
I couldn't, if there's 150% agreement, then it's 150%. You've actually hit upon or mentioned the fundamental fact that people have truly lost their faith in the elites after what they have experienced. And that's why the effort. Now, let me give you some practical problems that you face. Because when you are actually challenging corruption, as our government is doing at the moment, you are creating very powerful enemies. And those enemies seek many ways of sabotage, of policy. They use all sorts of, including social media, in order. They will never, of course, admit that their anger comes because their corruption at many levels is being challenged. Transparency is being introduced. Transparency at a massive level is being introduced. Gender empowerment is now the most significant element of India's economic policy. But this is creating massive ripples, as you will know from any form of experience. And to hold the electorate's trust while challenging the norm is really requires political communication of the highest order, because without the trust, the government is, the power of a government doesn't lie in the officers. The power of government lies in how much support you get from the people. Right? And actually on this, may I just add one thing which will interest you. When Gandhi came in 1915 back home to India, and this was his first, January 1915, and he went and met a mentor. And that mentor told him that, I believe you want to enter public life. He said, for 1 year, keep your mouth shut and your ears open. And for a year, Gandhi traveled all over without making a single speech, without saying a single word, and listening. Every Monday, he would keep mum. He would keep quiet. That was his day of listening.
So in the first few minutes of the panel, we talked a lot about what you actually do. Ida, as a politician, you described what you actually do to build trust. But a huge piece of this, and getting into the transparency piece, is how you communicate in such a way that builds trust. Can you give us some, of your perspective as a politician on how you translate what you're doing to build trust on the buses and the trains, and how it is that you take that into a communications pattern that feels genuine and real?
I first of all try to be honest. So if there's something I don't know, or something that I find in the room nobody's speaking about, or if there's something inconvenient, I will talk about it at some point. Or if there's something I can't do or can't fix, I'll tell people. Secondly, I will, for a question like this one on corruption, my country is not on Denmark doesn't come up in the top of the most corrupt countries, but maybe we should, because if you measure the new form of power, which is not money maybe, it's network. It is, you scratch my back, I scratch your back. We have no social mobility in my country. We actually basically have the elites not moving. So if we don't want to, that's another kind of poverty. And it's heartfelt from our people that they're being kept out. So if I don't show a real interest in people's life, if I don't really try and figure out ways of letting them know that I care and that I get them, I'm never going to be able to talk to them. So why would they ever trust me? I even come out of a political family. My name is like a politician's name. I'm so, disabled from the beginning. So I really have to go further to do this. So that's one thing. And the second is to respect people. And I think there's a big thing here of you all thinking, no, not you all, we all thinking that, oh, Trump, it was false consciousness. They didn't know what they were doing. They elected this president. They have no clue what he's going to do to them. No, maybe they disagree. Maybe they thought what we did were just terrible for so many years. We never talked about the flip side of trade. We never talked about the flip side of immigration. We never talked about the problems honestly. And I think that would be always my starting point, to accept that people can have experiences, even if data shows them they're wrong. I will accept that they can have an experience of some kind of fear or of, feeling left out or, uncertainty, that I would accept. and acknowledge. And then I consider people smart. I do think they're smart.
Yeah.
And I have one question for you, and I was going to take it up this morning in the brainstorm, but I haven't thought it through, so I need your help. But what if what we're seeing with social media is the same thing that happened with the printed press? Like, what if in those times when we had letters and print, the elites were freaking out? Like, it's no longer going to be Latin. You know, we're all going to speak a common language. Everybody can write whatever they want. It's going to be chaos. Like, they were freaking out. How are we going to give all that power to people? What if we see the next layer of that? What if we really see real democracy right now? It's messy, it's maybe not beautiful, but what if we see what happens when a lot of people get a voice and there's no privileged point of speaking, where you can only get through if you have relevance? What if that's what's happening? What if we just need to get those platforms that do have a lot of responsibility, because you do decide quite a lot with your algorithms and with the silos and with the echo chambers. What if you step up to this reality and say it's a new form of democracy where voices will be heard, and we don't only want the voices that are the most radical voices from the sides, but also sane people from the middle. We want to find ways of getting that conversation going. I think it could be the next step in democracy that we were seeing then.
Inclusiveness, building trust. There was a gentleman over here. And as a reminder, please let us know your name and affiliation.
My name is Ghadi Sari. I'm managing partner of Governance House, which is a post-conflict consultancy in the Middle East. Now, last year we talked a lot about ISIS. That was one of the main themes. And everyone promised, as policymakers, as think tank conglomerations, that we were going to get rid of ISIS, and that was done. But it wasn't followed by a proper development plan. Now, the people in the Middle East believed in that, and they trusted that we would get rid of ISIS, and that happened. But now that momentum is being lost. So is the problem with trust as well the loss of momentum in certain moments where trust could have been built with certain communities and those being missed? And related to that, and this is something we notice more with tech companies, a lot of the business that comes in the Middle East is trying to beat up legislation that has already happened in the West to sort of make gains that they otherwise can make in the West. Isn't that also leading to mistrust in big organizations coming to do business in areas like the Middle East or perhaps in Africa or other areas in the world? Thank you.
Thank you. Nick, I'd like you to start us off on this one, and also perhaps we can really think about as this relationship between information that people trust and don't trust, and as the global nomadic elite, as Ida would perhaps describe all of us, start to get involved. Is this going to lead to just greater and greater scrutiny by the government on what it is that the companies are doing, and where it is that you see this going?
Yeah, so one very, very complicated question, and then a second complicated question. So forgive me if I talk slowly while I'm thinking. I want to pick up a point that Ida made actually about the printing press first. The consumer internet is only about 20 years old, and I think we need to be very, very careful that we're at the end of the evolution of the consumer internet, and that where we are is where we're going to stay. You're already seeing movements around AI and machine learning technology. You're already seeing a lot of technology around voice. The Internet of Things hasn't really touched anyone yet. That's going to come very, very quickly. You're going to have another billion people coming online. Those people are going to start their own Googles, their own Facebooks, their own Twitter. They're going to change the way that the world works. You have technology companies now from outside the US growing internationally. The role of WeChat, for example, that's spreading a different kind of technology platform. What I don't think people want to do is have tech companies decide what's true and what's false. I think there's a pretty clear sense there that if we get into that game, then we're going to be part of the same issue, which is that people will say that's misinformation, not based on any kind of quantitative assessment, but based on the fact they disagree with it. And we see that every day in terms of people who report things to us. And there's no one on the panel from YouTube, so I will steal their stat. The most reported video on YouTube for terrorism is a Justin Bieber video. People will use the tools that we put in place to try and silence others, however worthy silencing Justin Bieber may be in your own view. So I think the big long-term question for us is we actually need as tech platforms to maintain trust from our users. You may have seen our CEO talking last week about how we're not transparent enough around the decisions we make when we remove accounts, when we say things that you can't do.
So there's a big challenge there for us to actually make sure that we are more transparent. Our rules are clearly understood. As a growing platform, our rules get longer and more complex as behavior changes. So there's a challenge for us there. And then I think on the ISIS question, I think there's a broader policy point there. And I think this is counterintuitive coming from someone whose platform is based on 140 characters. We have, and I say we as everyone in this room and kind of people who are involved in policy discussions, lost the desire to argue for complexity. So the desire for we will defeat X, that's the objective for the year, rather than saying, well, actually, what does that mean? Do we mean the ideology? Do we mean the geographical territory? Do we mean the religious crossovers with other parts of faith? Do we mean the geopolitical terrain? Well, it was just defeat X. And so I think that is where we all need to be much better at saying, it's not as simple as just saying we can fix fake news by changing a few algorithms. There's something much more structural to that, and I think part of it is having more conferences, so maybe we'd disagree with that, but rather than having conferences where we focus on the problem, what's the solution? And I think for me, in terms of media literacy, when I was at school, I was taught the difference between a primary source and a secondary source when I was like 10 years old. And I guess my question is, have we stopped doing that? In the same way as now we have fact-checking. And we didn't have that 20 years ago. We have fact-checking blogs everywhere. And at what point did journalism and fact-checking get separated? Because that's quite strange. And I think if we can have a more detailed conversation about the complexity of the problem, we'll get better solutions. And then we won't pander to coming up with these, we will do X wonderful thing. And when we don't deliver that, we feed into the hands of populists who say, see, they're just taking you for a ride.
So Ida's dying to come in.
Yeah, I just want to build on that, because I think if we're to have a real democracy where everybody sort of partakes in understanding why politics is difficult, you have to involve people. They think there is a need decision, and politicians always make bad decisions. I mean, and the truth is there's often a bad decision and a terrible decision. And you take the bad one and you try and make it a little better by getting interests together. And if you can involve people into that process, into the decision making, into understanding that there's a flip side to almost all changes, they will accept much more. And in my time in the ministry, we actually created a whole agenda called Open Ministry, where I forced all civil servants in the system to go out and talk to people, talk to hundreds and hundreds of people on how to solve these problems, and engaging them in figuring out how to do this. Way before we came out with the laws and just did a hearing, we started already there. And that is at least one way of trying solving and really engaging people in the complexities of making political decisions. And I thought, maybe to your question down there on the Middle East, politicians tend to like, crisis, and then we leave. And the crisis, ISIS is gone, we'll leave. And we're not that big on implementation and on following up. And I think to be a really good politician, you have to really solve problems and understand that next layer. It's like when the flames are gone, that's where the real momentum is. And for the EU, I would say, don't think of this as a new normal where everybody loves each other because of Brexit. No, this is like the moment of opportunity not to miss, to really, really think about how to transform and really, really make an EU that solves people's problems. And this is the time. This is not like, no, now it's a new great time. We got rid of them and we can focus on us.
Involving people in the decision-making process as a mechanism for building trust. I like that. Okay, what we're going to do now, we're entering our last few minutes here, so I'm going to take a little group of questions, beginning with, there's a hand at the back there.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Nicholas. I'm from Singapore. I work for a non-government organization, but I've also been a journalist for over 17 years. Very interesting views from everyone, and I think a couple of issues that we maybe need to zoom in on a little bit. The honorable member from Denmark was saying, why doesn't social media become a great democratizer and give everybody a chance to have a voice? I think one of the things we haven't really discussed is the weaponization of digital and social media by state, non-state actors, those propagating messages of violent extremism, those who are pushing or hoping to influence politics in other countries. And the problem with the comparison between the printing press and social media, digital media, is that the barriers to entry for the printing press were very high. The costs were very high, and there was a certain standard, I think Mr. Pickles mentioned, about quality and fact-checking and certain standards. With social media, that's gone, and I think the opportunity for people to abuse it, especially those with resources, whether it's finances or manpower, large state organizations willing to push certain agenda on social media, make it a little bit difficult for people to then trust or have an honest discourse, because you never really know who you're talking to. Is it a bot? Is it a wall of bots? Is it a bot factory, a troll factory? My second question that I have is that if we look at the necessity for countering violent extremism, for example, it's not necessarily when we hear the political point of view about authenticity and speaking with a common voice or listening to people. It's about really the technical aspects. What's going to capture people's attention online? What's going to be the thing that makes them click on it? Is it a cute picture of a kitten? Is it more video? That kind of discussion is something that I don't think a lot of people have figured out yet. My biggest concern is, what does this then mean for the future generation? Again, coming to what Mr. Pickles was saying about learning first and secondary sources in school. How are kids going to grow up looking at media or social media if they've grown up and that's all they ever know, and that's the only thing they don't trust or don't trust? I wouldn't know how to look at that future.
Okay, thank you. So I'll take a few more, please. India.
Tanji Morgan, you hit on the subject of AI, and I think as we talk about echo chambers and all of the populism and all of the discussions earlier today, my big concern is around the lack of diversity in setting the algorithms, as we've seen with Facebook and various others that come out with various, and the machines learn off of biased data, if you will.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a hand over here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Kate Gibbons of Clifford Chance and Chatham House. And I'm just wondering, is trust really the problem? Or is it that in reality we have a collision of values, for example, between liberalism and nationalism, religious faith and secularism, and therefore we're trying to address the wrong problem?
Thank you. And the gentleman here? Just wait for the mic to arrive. The gentleman here. Here we go.
Thanks a lot. Attila Roque from Brazil, Director for Foundation. Somehow going back to the question put by the Ministry about the raising distrust on nation states, I wonder if a big problem we have as international community is how we reimagine national states from a perspective of inclusion of its own diversity, which actually exists in the world. Because a lot of the problem we are seeing today, that the national states are being reimagined from a perspective of fear. And the perspective of fear led you to identify one enemy or one part of your people as your enemy, right? And then you are seeing all kinds of fundamentalism of all sorts to develop in Brazil, in the US, in other parts of the world, in Europe. So a lot, what we talk about America first, Britain first, whatever first, who first? Who we are talking about? So the challenge I think we have, when you think, for instance, about social media, is that the algorithms, for instance, the problem is that they are reinforcing that the sense when they led us to talk only about among ourselves, among those who think like us. So it seems that we are very loud and we are a lot when we are attacking LGBT people and we are accusing that religion or other religion, but actually it sounds loud because we are talking about a lot of ourselves only. So anyway, I don't have a solution. I think it's a huge challenge when you think about democracy and participation and fight for equality, right?
So there's an interesting common thread here with some of these questions, which to me gets to the responsibility point. Who, if we feel in this room that we have a deficit in trust, who is responsible for helping to rebuild that? Michael, do you want to start us off?
Wow, nice easy question. So first I want to pick up the question about the role of social media, though. Our starting point, certainly my starting point, is people are a hell of a lot smarter than we often give them credit for, right? And in the latest news cycles, they're receiving information from trusted sources, people like them, so they trust the information. Now they know that that is not always a smart idea, right? So there's a correction at all ages, people starting to question the sources that they're getting, even if it comes from somebody they like. And so yes, well, I think the platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and others need to do more. I think people are pretty smart, and they're going to start migrating away from those platforms if the platforms don't solve the problem. My two daughters, 19 and 21, have already opted out of Facebook, as an example, right? So let's give people credit for their intelligence. Look, the responsibility, trust is ultimately forward-looking, and it's, do you believe future outcomes? Reputation is backward-looking, trust is forward-looking. And I think the responsibility is for everyone. It's not just waiting for the elites to solve, it is certainly not waiting for elites to solve it, right? I think what we need to do, those in power need to recognize, is that the concerns that are creating a lack of trust are real, right? This is not just a communication, they're real concerns, there are real dislocations, and all institutions need to be more forthright in having the debates and the conversations about what's broken as well as what's right, and engaging people in a very authentic way in those conversations, like Ida was saying. So I think to point the finger at any one part of the system is not the answer. I think it's the system.
Ida, I know you want to come in. MJ, I just want to really quickly come to you. In addition to some of these questions that have been posed to the panel, you really emphasize the nation state in your opening remarks. But so much of what we read about our lack of trust today has to do with this threat of what is globalization doing for me? Do you reject that theory as one of the primary drivers of mistrust in our world?
The nation state was created as the building block for the architecture of stability. And it wasn't created simply for itself. It was created for the whole world, right? I mean, it is a modern idea, and it was created for a modern environment. Post-empire, before the nation state, armies decided where the boundaries would end. Today, it's the will of the people which decides. And therefore, from there emerges some very important, I hope, lessons which will address a large number of issues. We don't have time for, I think, specific. But to take up the case of the ISIS, for example, the ISIS will not be defeated only by winning the battle. You have to win the argument. Because this is an age which is going to be determined by what people believe, by the trust in what they believe. And therefore, have we done enough? We've spent heaven knows how many trillions of dollars on the battle. How much actually have we spent on trying to win the argument after the battle? In Afghanistan, people forget that the Taliban was defeated comprehensively. How did it come back to the point of chaos that we see today? Because we didn't win the argument with the poor. We didn't win the argument with next generation. So I think it's extremely important. One of the serious dangers of this combination of religion and nationalism is this is controlled by faith supremacists, people who believe in one faith supremacy, whereas the modern state believes in faith equality. So everyone is an equal before the state. But one of the consequences of faith supremacy as a model for governance is that it leads essentially to a jelly state, which is a state which is inherently unstable. Unlike butter, it doesn't melt away. But like jelly, it keeps shivering all the time. And if you add nuclear weapons to such a state, you get a very toxic jelly state. But sometimes, and in the earlier panel also this was discussed, the possibilities and the potential of the turbulence that we see today is sometimes beyond the ability of imagination to measure the fright and fear.
Well, that actually leads into the question about values from our colleague here. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap up for lunch. So, Ida, I would love, I know you wanted to come in before, so I'd love to hear what you have to say. And Nick, perhaps you can just finally address this question on the weaponization of social media and the diversity of the algorithm before we depart.
Okay. Well, I was just thinking about how trust works. I mean, trust cannot be forced. we build trust. And I think that's worth remembering, that we have to have some kind of patience. And the first thing I think is important that we are having this conversation. We didn't have this conversation 5 years ago. We didn't really have that kind of conversation. So it's a good place to start, and we should forgive ourselves that we have not fixed it completely. And you know, just having an interest in normal people's lives is a good place to start. And to be honest, I've experienced so many global elites. I've been part of it myself. Traveling, I even saw a woman writing, home is where I lay my laptop. I'm like, oh my God. I mean, how disconnected can you be from your roots, from people's lives, from what normal life people live? I mean, you have to go back to that and respect that in order to build this trust. Then you have to have a face. So every system needs to have a face or a voice of some kind. We talked about Facebook not having a voice, not speaking. So we will lose trust in an organization that will not come forward and have a conversation with us. So I think all organizations should think about really getting a face that is open and always there for conversation, and an honest conversation. And then really to respect the partner you're talking to. And the third thing which makes it very complicated into this discussion on nation state is that I do believe that we cannot see identity policy as something completely contagious that we do not want to touch. Because people have lost roots, they have lost feeling of who they are, they've lost feeling of meaning, they've lost religion, they've lost a lot of things. So unless we feel that it's okay to also have some kind of affiliation to your own culture, to your own religion, to your own identity, and that doesn't make you a nationalist or an aggressor, I don't think we will solve this. So for me, to the question over here, liberalism and nationalism does not have to be contradictory. Or maybe we should call it patriotism, something else. But don't forget that people do have cultural traits that I think are okay. It's like we accept every other culture, not our own. Don't talk too much about your own culture, because then you're like an offender. I think that is wrong. I think we should respect that and go back and give some space for that in a generous way, in an inclusive way. And majorities that are not afraid are much better at treating minorities well than majorities that feel threatened. So respect the majorities in a way where they don't feel that they have to take away all their cultural traits or their identity. I think it's very important to also build this trust.
Nick, a few words?
So firstly, on diversity, 100% yes. One of the reasons why several companies in Silicon Valley now publish transparency reports on the diversity of their workforces is because of how important this is, but also to try and build some trust that we take this issue seriously. I would also add to that, from having spent a lot of time in California, political diversity is extremely important. There is a Californian worldview that isn't shared around the world. I think on the information point, this is the issue we take extremely seriously. We suspend about 3.2 million accounts every week from people who are not respecting our rules in terms of how they spread and share information. That said, there will be people on our platform who share perfectly lawfully values, opinions, statements, pieces of information that I may not agree with and that I may not react to. But we need to ask, why is information effective? The messenger is absolutely critical. Are they credible with the audience? But more importantly, is there something that actually makes it resonate? And so this is where we actually have to look beyond the information and say, if you're looking at sort of extremist narratives, it's far more complex than just the internet. Is there poverty? Is there grievance? Is there a lack of feeling they have a sense of belonging that's being offered by the messenger? So the same is true in public diplomacy. There is absolutely, I think clearer than we've ever seen in many years, a battle of values happening. The question is, who is going to make the argument for the values that many of us in this room, the liberal democratic values, hold dear? And my worry is that while we are deciding who should do that, we push responsibility to other people and try and say, well, can you make the problem go away? Rather than understanding we have global technology now that can mean we can make these arguments to more people quicker and better than ever before. I'm just not sure we're using them.
Well, it's ironic that we're having this conversation in a train station. Trains, of course, are largely connected to the democratization of travel in the 19th century. The middle class started to travel because they could come to a place like this and begin their journey to leave their hometown. And here we're talking about the democratization of information as a potential driver both for the positive and the sinister and negative in terms of how it is that we see and understand the values we wrap around trust and the exercise of building it. Thank you so much to everybody on the panel for joining us. Please do give our panelists a round of applause and enjoy your lunch.